So good morning, everybody, and thank you all for your patience. We're starting with the webcast, which is right now. So it's really a great pleasure to welcome everybody here to this policy forum on peacebuilding in Africa, which is being held in conjunction with the publication of this new volume, which is a 25-chapter handbook on peacebuilding in Africa, which I think is really an important new volume, which provides a major overview of ongoing efforts to strengthen peace building on the African continent. And a number of the people in this room are authors who've contributed to the volume. Our distinguished panel this morning includes Professors Adeke Adebajo from the University of Johannesburg and Ismail Rashid from Vassar College, Ms. Helen Kazi Nwoha from Uganda, from a major NGO based there that's promoting women's rights and empowerment, particularly in South Sudan and Uganda and the East African region. And then Mr. Eloa Otobo, who was formerly from the UN Peacebuilding Commission. So each of these individuals has played an important role in peace building and advancing the goal of long-term peace building in Africa for many years, as well as having written really excellent and incisive chapters in this book that I've just mentioned to you. So it's a very great honor to have with us this morning Ambassador Fatima Kayara Mohammed, the newly arrived permanent observer of the African Union to the United Nations. And I really want to thank you very much for taking this time to be with us in your first weeks here. And I had the pleasure of meeting you 2 days ago here. We very much appreciate your sharing some of your insights with us this morning on the important evolving role of the African Union in advancing the cause of long-term sustaining peace in Africa, working together with Africa's regional economic communities and the United Nations. With new leadership in Addis Ababa, and now with you here at the UN, this is indeed a moment, it seems to me, for strengthening the relationship between the African Union and the United Nations. So everybody in the room here, we want to wish you a lot of success. Ambassador Mohammed brings to her new position here a distinguished career in promoting peace building in Africa. She has worked for more than a decade at ECOWAS, the Economic Community of African States, the West African states, in various positions focused on peace and security and regional integration and organizational development. Previously, she worked as executive director of West Africa Conflict and Security Consulting, which is a company that works at the intersection of security, research, development, and investment in conflict area affected and fragile areas. She's also worked for the European delegation to Nigeria and to the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Many of you may know the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which has been very active in many countries in Africa. And most notably, it seems to me, you've set up your own foundation for the Likes Minds project, whose objective is to help disadvantaged women, children, and youth, especially IDPs in northeast Nigeria, to integrate into their communities. So there's a tremendous background that you bring with you here. So you bring a lot of valuable experience, and again, we wish you great success. So I'd like to invite you to come up here. I'm going to switch places with you to share your insights with us, and then we'll have the panel, and then, time permitting, we'll have some Q&A. Ambassador.
Thank you, Ambassador Hirsch. Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to be here. It's actually my second time in the last few weeks that I've taken up my new position. So IPI is becoming a good friend. And I'm also honored to be making the opening remarks on this very important event on peace building in Africa. I would like to commend IPI and the Institute for African Thought and Conversation of the University of Johannesburg for convening this very timely and very important discussion. I'd also wish to thank you for your kind invitation to make introductory remarks on the AU's role in peace building. Let me start by recalling the very idea of peace building, which is strongly anchored in the wide shared conviction that there cannot be peace without development and vice versa, and that peace and development cannot thrive without human rights and good governance. It's indeed this firm conviction that underpins the AU's approach in fulfilling its central mandate to achieve a peaceful and prosperous Africa. In line with the provisions of the Constitutive Act of the African Union and the protocol relating to the establishment of the Peace and Security Council, the AU has, over the last decade, assumed greater responsibilities on conflict prevention, management, resolution, post-conflict reconstruction, and development. In the area of peace building, the AU has adopted in July 2006 its post-conflict reconstruction and development policy, with the main objective of consolidating peace and preventing relapse into violence. The implementation of this policy has progressively enabled the AU Commission to take concrete actions and assist countries emerging from conflict. In this regard, the AU has regularly deployed missions to assess the priority needs of the concerned member states. These include identification of joint activities in support of peace agreements, conducting needs assessments missions, consolidating and scaling up security sector reform and DDR, technical and operational support to control the illicit proliferation of small arms and light weapons, and sustained collaboration with regional mechanisms and civil society organizations, which are critical for peace building, especially on the grassroots level. Preventing post-conflict electoral crises, including through the development of observers, remains one of our priorities in this context. The African Union's engagement has also been geared towards developing and implementing quick impact projects, or what we call peace strengthening projects, in the areas of development of the AU's peace support operations and through our AU liaison offices. For example, with the support of our partners, the AU mission in Somalia, AMISOM, has undertaken a wide range of quick impact projects that include schools, rehabilitation, construction of hospitals, police stations in different regions of the country. Furthermore, where its efforts to mobilize support from within the continent for countries emerging from conflict is concerned, the AU launched in 2014 the African Solidarity Initiative, with the aim of mobilizing both financial and, most importantly, in-kind contributions from African countries, private sector, and other potential contributors. In addition to that, the recent operationalization of the AU Peace Fund that will, amongst others, address factors regarding mediation, preventive diplomacy, institutional capacity building, and peace support operations will further enhance the role and effectiveness of the AU in peace building. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of lessons learned from the AU experience, I wish to highlight 3 points as follows. First, for peace to be irreversible in Africa, more work needs to be done to address in a coherent and more coordinated manner the structures, attitudes, and processes that perpetuate conflict and instability. There is a need to shift from the current top-down approach to a more people-centered paradigm with a specific focus on peace dividends, especially for women and youth. Second, the importance of establishing close cooperation and working relationships among national, regional, and international actors cannot be overemphasized. In this context, given that Africa remains the major regional focus of the UN peacebuilding architecture, the partnership between the AU and the UN is crucial. The AU, through its PCRD, and the UN, through its PBA, have much to learn from each other's approaches and experiences, and from seeking greater cooperation and collaboration. The recently signed joint AU-UN framework for enhanced partnership in peace and security, and the subsequent memorandum of understanding between the AU Commission and the Peacebuilding Support Office have provided a solid framework to strengthen cooperation in support of peace building and sustaining peace efforts in Africa. We are extremely appreciative of the UN Secretary General's untiring efforts and strong commitment to consolidate and further promote the AU-UN strategic partnership, as highlighted in his report on peace building and sustaining peace issued recently. Third, throughout the peace building process, our collective endeavors will amount to little if there is no corresponding effort to mobilize adequate resources for the implementation of our defined priorities. No significant progress can be made without adequate financial resources and technical support. The main challenges that the PCRD implementation has been facing are related to the amount of resources and expertise it demands and the high-level political and diplomatic engagement it requires to be successful. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to conclude by re-emphasizing once more the importance between peace and security. I believe that the major challenge, the nexus between peace and development. I believe that the major challenge that needs to be addressed at the international level, including through the ongoing reform processes, both at the UN and the AU, is how to ensure a balance between security and long-term sustainable development. We cannot have sustainable peace if we do not address the root causes and ensure our population's basic needs are addressed. This requires commitment from all stakeholders. I thank you for your attention.
First of all, thank you very much for your remarks this morning. And again, we wish you all success. Adam Lupel, who's our vice president, sends everybody here his regrets. He's got a bad cold. He emailed me about midnight last night telling me that he would be unable to be here this morning, but IPI's here in a strong way, and we're really glad that you're all here. So we're going to go right to our panel, and our first speaker here is Professor Adeke Adebajo on my left, who for a number of years was the dynamic leader of our Africa program here at IPI, even when it was IPA still, and then went on to be the head of the Center for Conflict Resolution in Cape Town and put CCR on the map as an African-wide research institution, bringing many, many of these issues forward for all of us to think about. And he is currently, as is in your program, director of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg. So Ade, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, John, and good to be back and good to be co-hosting this event. And I just wanted to thank you, Adam, and all the other IPI colleagues for putting this together. I'll be very quick in terms of my own input. I realize there are quite a few of us, and I'm basically going to just build on the foreword that I provided for the book on 3 prophets of Pax Africana. So this 25-chapter book, I hope we'll be able to pass it around, is one of the first comprehensive assessments of Africa's security architecture over the last 3 post-Cold War decades. It was conceived by the Cape Town-based Center for Conflict Resolution while I was its executive director, and the volume is authored primarily by eminent African scholars and practitioners, joined by equally eminent colleagues from beyond the continent. Scholar diplomats like Francis Deng, Ibrahim Gambari, James Jonah, and Augustine Mahiga, the current Tanzanian foreign minister, are joined by eminent scholars such as Kenneth Omeje, Ishmael Rashid Seranawan, and Oliver Richmond. And the 6 parts of the book examine the theory and praxis of Pax Africana, conflict prevention and peacemaking, peacekeeping, themes in peacekeeping, specific themes, peace building, and then the role of external actors. It's particularly fitting that the volume honors 3 prophets of Pax Africana: Kenya's Ali Mazrui, Egypt's Boutros Boutros-Ghali, and Nigeria's Margaret Vogt, who joined the ranks of the ancestors in the hereafter that Mazrui had described as after Africa in 2014, Mazrui and Vogt, and 2016, Boutros-Ghali. The chapter by Mazrui is from his 1967 book, which coined the concept of Pax Africana 50 years ago. And the late Margaret Vogt, the former director of IPI's Africa program, I took over from her actually, has a chapter appropriately on the UN and Africa's regional organization. And the conference on which this book is based, I believe, was one of her last conferences. So it's great to be able to publish this posthumously. 2017 was the golden jubilee of the publication of Mazrui's Pax Africana. And this volume actually opens with a chapter by him in that famous book. Through this idea, Mazrui called for Africans to create, cultivate, and consolidate peace on their own continent. And his idea of continental jurisdiction was a type of Monroe Doctrine, urging outsiders to stay out of Africa and let Africans resolve their own conflicts. And in the related idea of racial sovereignty, Mazrui argued that interventions by brotherly African states in each other's disputes was more legitimate than those by outsiders. But the question that Mazrui posed 50 years ago still has not been answered. Who will keep the peace in Africa now that the colonial powers are departing? He noted that Pax Britannica was the very antithesis of Pax Africana, as it championed the pacification of savage natives and the idea that white races had to disarm darker races in order to rule over them. Mazrui thus regarded laws to disarm Africans as a negation of their warrior tradition and the reduction of Africans to children. He later controversially called for Africans to renounce the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, arguing that a nuclear-armed continent was perhaps the shock needed for nuclear states to disarm. He noted that the nuclearization of the warrior tradition would restore the Third World's adulthood, which imperialism had stripped away. Even more than he focused attention on Africa's domestic travails, Mazrui also identified the pernicious role of external actors such as the US, Russia, and France during, and in some cases, after the Cold War, as having contributed to Africa's continuing conflicts and negated Pax Africana. So Mazrui consistently criticized Pax Americana's war on terror, as well as Pax Gallica's continuing neo-colonial interventions on the continent, urging instead that actual and potential hegemons like your Nigeria, South Africa, Ethiopia, Egypt, etc., seek to assume a gatekeeping role to keep Africa free of external meddlers. So these are topics that are also covered in this book, and my own chapter in the book actually looks at the rivalry between Nigeria and France in Mali in 2012-2013. After the Cold War, Mazrui had controversially pushed the idea of UN trusteeship as a way of Africa avoiding the control of neocolonial powers. He was often ahead of his time, as 80% of UN peacekeepers are today deployed on the continent. And though some of these missions are subject still to neo-imperial machinations, with Paris, London, and Washington drafting all of the resolutions in all 6 African cases, and nationals of these 3 countries heading the peacekeeping political affairs and humanitarian affairs in the UN Secretariat, a grotesque kind of like, overwhelming power. It is mostly African and Asian peacekeepers that actually do most of the peacekeeping on the ground, and 13 of the top 20 contributors to UN peacekeeping are African countries. Egyptian scholar diplomat Boutros Boutros-Ghali, our second prophet of Pax Africana, served as the first African UN Secretary General between 92 and 96. And he was the most intellectually accomplished of the 8 Secretaries General in the history of the post. And during his tenure, he sought to play the role of the Pope on the East River, bluntly condemning the double standards of powerful countries in selectively intervening in rich men's wars, as he called them, in the Balkans, while ignoring Africa's orphan conflicts. His enduring legacy to Pax Africana will be an agenda for peace of 1992, which basically set out the main tools and techniques for conflict prevention, peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building in the post-Cold War era. And this book, in fact, is arranged around those 4 themes that Boutros-Ghali had outlined in his book. He also contributed, of course, to the idea of multidimensional peace-building operations in Namibia, Mozambique, and Liberia, as well as international criminal tribunals in Rwanda and ex-Yugoslavia. Our final prophet of Pax Africana is Nigerian scholar practitioner Margaret Vogt. She was a Pan-African peacemaker and scholar diplomat who contributed tremendously to Africa's evolving security architecture. She led a team of experts that established the OAU security mechanism by 1992, and then the ECOWAS security mechanism 7 years later. And these were some of the first security mechanisms established based on the ECOMOG interventions in Sierra Leone and Liberia in the 1990s. She spent 15 years working for the cause of peace at the UN, chef de cabinet also at the AU to Conakry, deputy special representative of the UN Political Office for Somalia, and then special representative of the UN Peacebuilding Office in Central African Republic. And all of these experiences have been captured in her rich chapter. So it is to these 3 prophets of Pax Africana that the book is dedicated, and the framing of the volume has benefited tremendously from their work. And the final question that I want to leave you with is that our generation of Africans actually has to redefine and formulate Mazrui's question: who will keep the peace in Africa now that the Cold War has ended? Thank you.
Well, Ade, that's just a great overview of the book. And even though several of his former colleagues, Tony Carbo and Kudrat Verk, did a great job in editing this book, it was actually Ade's leadership that brought this book into existence, and emerging from several conferences that you held in CCR as well as your own work. And I really appreciate your tribute to Margaret, who was a close friend of many of us in the room and who was the first head of the Africa program here at IPA at the time. So we all miss Margaret a lot. And she was just the most wonderful person, as well as a scholar, diplomat here. So our second speaker, I'm really glad you're here, Helen. And we had lunch yesterday, which was a great opportunity to learn a little bit about your work. And Helen Kazi Nwoha is the executive director of ISIS Women's International Cross-Cultural Exchange, based in Kampala. But she's been working a great deal in South Sudan and in Burundi. I know we have several guests here from both of those countries. So I really appreciate your joining us. And I'd like to ask you to share your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important panel discussing peace building in Africa. I'm going to be focusing on 3 countries, Uganda, South Sudan, and Burundi, and for 2 reasons. These are the countries that ISIS Wiki focuses its work on. And in South Sudan, we are carrying out a research documenting grassroots women's peace efforts. So that gives me an opportunity to share some of the initial findings in terms of how women are engaging in the South Sudan peace process. For Burundi, we have also been involved in supporting women in the ongoing peace process. And of course, we are based in Uganda, so we've done some bit of peace building work. So my presentation is actually based on field work we are doing as ISIS Wiki. I will first share what women have done, what has worked, and the challenges to women's participation. I will then make recommendations for their effective inclusion and participation in ongoing peace processes. In Uganda, ISIS Wiki, the Forum for Women in Democracy and Institute for Social Transformation, convened the Women's Situation Room, a women's-led peace-building strategy that focuses on building peace before, during, and after elections. This initiative was carried out in 2016, February, during the last elections in Uganda. What we did was to train about 450 women and youths and provided them with tools to monitor the elections. The second phase involved the establishment of a physical room led by 10 eminent women from Uganda and 5 from the region. Their role was to mediate on issues reported from the field by the women who were trained as observers and deployed in 15 districts in Uganda. Following the controversies after the elections, the eminent women engaged in shuttle diplomacy that has led to discussions for a national dialogue process for Uganda, which is still in the initial stages. The Women's Situation Room is part of the working group of CIS that is working on the national dialogue. And they are also part of the FEMWISE, one of the arms of the African Union Panel of the WISE, established to promote women's participation in mediation in Africa. What has worked for us in that case? We stayed focused and kept away a lot from the media, and we did not discuss so much about the engagement. And that helped us a lot because there were a lot of speculations in terms of how the main actors in the elections were taking the process forward. For South Sudan, when the conflict broke out in 2013, of course, it shocked everyone, including the South Sudanese themselves. But women quickly organized themselves to take position on the next steps. They held meetings in Kampala, which was hosted by ISIS Wiki, and in Nairobi, hosted by UN Women. Each of these meetings developed position papers calling for immediate cessation of hostilities and for peace in South Sudan. Women from these meetings moved immediately to Addis Ababa in January 2014 to engage with the IGAD peace process. Their lobbying and advocacy led to the inclusion of women on both sides of the warring parties. These inclusions were seen not to be neutral. Therefore, there was need to push for more neutral representation from civil society, and this was also accepted. At the country level, women continued to gather to articulate their positions and also begin to the process of building peace within the communities. Women formed networks. For example, the Network for Women for Peace in South Sudan, the Women's Monthly Forum. These platforms provided opportunities for women to articulate their issues. The religious groups worked also to receive refugees in church premises and provide emergency response in the midst of limited resources. A national conference on women and peace building developed a position paper on what South Sudan women would want, and this became the advocacy tool. This conference was supported by UN Women. 2 women from civil society were then included. Of course, they influenced the processes, and I can say that the first peace agreement signed was very gender sensitive in terms of looking at issues of sexual violence and insisting on women's participation. In the ongoing revitalization process, women have again continued to engage across religious lines to promote and ensure their participation in the IGAD-led process. 2 meetings have been held so far with position papers presented to IGAD, who in turn invited women to join the process. There is a technical group supporting the team each time the IGAD Revitalization Forum is meeting to continuously support the team of women. There is a link, they have created a link with civil society organizations at the national level and engagement with women across the country. The organizing and progress of Women of South Sudan is a good example of progress on women's participation in peace building in Africa. For Burundi, the dialogue intended to support national reconciliation, while an important process, for implementing the Arusha Peace Agreement and working towards durable peace has yet to make any significant progress. The fourth dialogue session led by former Tanzania President Benjamin Mkapa, which took place in Arusha from November 27th to December 8, 2017, did not register any progress, even though women from both sides were invited to the dialogue. The situation of women's participation and inclusion of women-specific issues in the peace dialogue process and on the agenda is largely absent. The nature of the Burundi conflict, which saw many women civil society organizations leave the country, meant that these women had to organize from outside. However, within the country itself, women continue to organize and build peace at all levels. Women in diaspora continue to organize from outside and have links with the larger civil society groups to continue to amplify women's voices and the need for their participation in all peace-building processes. For example, the Movement for Women and Girls for Peace in Burundi has been doing such initiatives, and ISIS Wiki has also been working with them. In all cases, the challenges include the nature of governance and the context within which these conflicts are happening. In South Sudan and Burundi, leaders have acted with impunity, and most of the crimes committed are not accounted for. South Sudan signed a peace agreement that was not respected, particularly the national dialogue. Even though the government is implementing part of the agreements, like the national dialogue, insecurity remains a challenge, and citizens continue to cross over to Uganda, who happens to be hosting many of them from South Sudan. The substance of the different processes, such as the Burundi dialogue, is to maintain the government in power and invest in its security. This undermines social services spending and exposes women and girls to more danger of sexual violence, exploitation, and other forms of violence. I will end by these recommendations. I think South Sudan women need support to continue to organize and participate effectively in all peace-building processes. For Burundi, I would like to call that effort is made to push the government back into the dialogue and ensure that women participate. Bringing women together to develop a common agenda is also very important. Sustainable peace is the major objective for all stakeholders, and more so for women, and this is only possible if women are involved. Thank you.
Well, Helen, thank you very much. Your organization has taken on two of the most difficult challenges in Africa, namely in South Sudan and Burundi, and you've been very explicit and clear in underscoring that a lot more needs to be done, that you highlighted the issue of governance and the weakness or the absence of governance, however you want to define it, in those two countries. And the importance of the role of women in trying to push these leaders and their followers to change their approach and be much more inclusive about providing opportunities for women. And this feeds a lot into IPI's program on women, peace, and security. My good friend Sarah Taylor's here in the back of the room. So I want to thank you very, very much for coming and sharing those insights with us. So our third speaker is my friend Aloho Otobo, who has been involved for quite a while with the Peacebuilding Commission here, the UN Peacebuilding Commission, which was set up in 2005 at the 60th anniversary summit here. And he was the deputy head of the UN Peacebuilding Support Office at headquarters here. He was Assistant Secretary General in 2009. He also had been with the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs and in Addis Ababa with the UN Economic Commission for Africa that I remember visiting the first time that I went to Addis when it was still the OAU. So Aloho brings a lot of experience himself. He's right now the non-resident senior expert in peacebuilding and global economic policy at the Global Governance Institute in Brussels, Belgium. So Aloho, thank you again, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, John, for your invitation. And I would like to begin by responding to a comment that my good friend Adi made regarding the Mazuri's question that he posed in his famous chapter, which is reproduced, about who takes the lead. I think this is a tentative response before I go to my main presentation. I think if the African peace and security architecture functions effectively, it will meet the criteria that Mazuri set out in the book. But I said if, because there are so many qualifications. We can go into that during question and answer. Well, the reason why I'm participating in this panel is because I wrote chapter 19 of this book that is here, sharing my reflections on the Peacebuilding Commission. As John said, I was present at creation. I was the founding director of the office, and I also acted briefly as Assistant Secretary General in that office. So when I wrote this chapter, when the process of writing the book started, I had retired from the UN, and it was part of my reflection, 10-year reflection, on what is it that the Peacebuilding Commission has done. But that was only part of the reflection, because I've also published a book on peacebuilding, which is mentioned there. Now, there are three. I was grappling with a set of issues in writing that chapter. One was the perception of the Peacebuilding Commission. As I said, we started writing this book on the 10th anniversary of the Peacebuilding Commission. And at the time I concluded the chapter, the second review of the Peacebuilding Commission had taken place. The first review was in 2010, and the second review was in 2015. And that 2015 review was part of 3 reviews that took place that year. One was the one on the independent panel on peace operations, which my friend and colleague here, Yusuf, was a member. And the second one was the one on Resolution 1325. But this was an important one, the one on the peacebuilding architecture. But my reflection was not based on the reviews, but it was based on being an insider and having worked in the place. And I saw a number of issues that came up, and I decided to share them. And in doing so, I separated my writing into 3 areas: facts about the functioning and effectiveness of the Peacebuilding Commission, the fictions that were peddled about it, and the frustrations. But I will start with the frustrations, because that, in some sense, is key to some of the complaints that people have about the Peacebuilding Commission. And one of the main complaints was the third priority that Fatima referred to. And I put it there that the commission is not showing us the money. That was the way I put it colloquially, just for people to catch the essence. Because the feeling, and in the mandate of the Peacebuilding Commission, one of the tasks given to the Peacebuilding Commission is that they should marshal resources. And that is a big responsibility, not least because it starts with the word marshal, which, as you know, there was a Secretary of State, George Marshall, who had the Marshall Plan for Europe and the rest. So that has created very high expectations about the role that the Peacebuilding Commission should play in marshalling resources. Well, I can say, and I indicated that in the book, the Peacebuilding Commission has made some great strides, but they have not come anywhere in satisfying the expectations of the key stakeholders. Who are the key stakeholders? The governments of the countries that are on the agenda of the Peacebuilding Commission, the SRSGs. Mahmoud Yusuf, who is here, when he was ERSG in Burundi, we visited him, and I remember something that he said after lunch. He pulled me aside. That time we were developing something called the strategic framework. Both his insight and another good friend of mine, Schulenberg, who was ERSG in Sierra Leone, have been very fundamental in terms of this whole question of finance. Yusuf pulled me aside after lunch, which he hosted for us, and said, look, Eloha, after you guys have done your strategic framework, you've got to show money on the table to do some of these things. And I thought that was profound. 3 months later, I went to Sierra Leone, and my good friend Schulenberg made the same point, that the key priorities that you have set out have to be financed. So one of the key frustrations of the Peacebuilding Commission is that they are not showing money on the table. And for those of you who have read the latest report of the Secretary General called Peacebuilding and Sustaining Peace, and the report by the Security Council report, the NGO, they emphasize those 2 elements. In fact, in some respects, not only have we not made much progress, but globally, we have gone back. In the report of the SG, there is a figure there, the only figure in that whole report. it shows that in 2005, the year that the Peacebuilding Commission was established, the ODA to conflict-affected countries was 40% of the total ODA. That was in 2005. In 2015, 10 years after, by the second review, the ODA for conflict-affected countries has fallen to less than 28%. In terms of peace, in terms of ODA devoted to peace building, which is different from ODA to conflict-affected countries, in 2005, the year the Peacebuilding Commission, the decision was made to establish the Peacebuilding Commission in 2005. Peacebuilding ODA was 15%. It rose briefly to 18% in 2009 and is now at 13%. In other words, it has stagnated, it has fluctuated between 15% and 13%. So that tells you the magnitude of the problem. The second issue, which is in the debate, and I reflected on it, is the question of whether Peacebuilding Commission should focus on the hard issues or soft issues of peace building. For those of you who are in the literature on international affairs, this will remind you of the so-called soft power and the hard power. But this is nothing like that. Here, they are referring basically to, they define hard issues of peace buildings are things like institution building and things like mobilizing resources, which I just spoke about. And the support that the Peacebuilding Commission, the Peacebuilding Support Office, and the UN generally, those working in the peacebuilding architecture, give to soft issues like reconciliation, the civilian control of armed forces. Now, as you will notice, in the latter issue, which we classify as soft issues, what you see there basically is what you will call attitudinal and behavioral changes. They are not easy to measure. And that is one of the frustrations in trying to measure the work of the Peacebuilding Commission. Because suppose you follow the advocates who say that the Peacebuilding Commission should focus on soft issues. How are you going to measure that? So that brings me to my third point, and that will be the final one. It is what I call tangible versus intangible. In some ways, it is a mirror image of the soft and the hard issue. But this issue was the question of whether the work of the Peacebuilding Commission should be tangible or not tangible was starkly posed by the comments made by Ambassador Grant. He was the British ambassador at the time, I think between 2010 and 2015. They had undertaken a trip to Sierra Leone as part of the Security Council. And when he came back, he made this famous remark in the Security Council deliberations on Sierra Leone that the work of the Peacebuilding Commission was not tangible, was not easily detectable. So this stirred this whole debate, which is why if you read, there have been 3 major books published on the Peacebuilding Commission. The first one, written by Rob Jenkins, is called Peacebuilding from Concept to Commission. The second one is my book, Consolidating Peace in Africa, The Role of the UN Peacebuilding Commission. And the third one is edited by an academic called Cedric Conning. This is a South African academic. Now, what they did in the cover of their book was to put in the cover of their book the signposts of what we call Security and Justice Hub that the Peacebuilding Commission supported and was financed by Peacebuilding Fund as a way of bringing this tangibility. But the point to note is that not all activities that the Peacebuilding Commission is involved in can be tangible. So let me conclude with an anecdote by Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was for many years in UNDP here and later became president of Liberia and just stepped down because we interacted with her a lot when Peacebuilding, Liberia was on the Peacebuilding Commission and is still on the agenda of the Peacebuilding Commission. She told us in one of our meetings with her that when she was in UNDP as an assistant administrator, she used to emphasize this need of building technical competence, expertise, and the rest. But now as a president, there is a pressure on her to show to the people that what she's doing can be seen and can be felt. What was the moral of the story? She was encouraging us that we should support the country in developing 5 security and justice hubs in Liberia. By the way, that is discussed extensively in my book. But what she was telling was basically there has been a change in her belief about the balance to be struck between the government promoting expertise, developing critical knowledge, and people seeing something that the government is doing, which is expressed in buildings like the Security and Justice Hub that the Peacebuilding Commission decided to build in 5 of the sub-regional counties. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Aloha. Well, the first 3 presentations have all underscored that these challenges are all ahead of us, which has to do with, again, the evolving relationship between the African Union and the United Nations. So all of you are aware that there was an election in Sierra Leone on March 7. The results were announced last night. You needed 55% to win the election to become the president, and none of the candidates received the 55%. So there'll be a runoff on March 27 between the 2 leading vote getters here from the SLPP and the APC. So nobody knows all this better than Ismail Rashid, my friend, who is from Sierra Leone, has been ambassador for a number of years and on these programs before. And so I really thank you, Ishmael, for coming here this morning. It's not tonight. It was last night. And I give you the floor. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, John. And once more, I want to thank IPI. So this is almost a 20-year relationship. When Ade was here as Africa director, I think we did a lot of work, and I was a much more frequent visitor to the IPI then. I want to really just take off from where John essentially ended. That was on the issue of the election. So Sierra Leone, as he rightly points out, is holding its 5th post-war elections. The first technically post-war elections were held in the middle of the war in 1996. And as he said yesterday, the first round of the presidential elections results were read, and what we had was a near tie between the 2 historic parties in Sierra Leone, the All People's Congress and the Sierra Leone People's Party, for the presidential race. The holding 5 elections without reverting to conflict tells a very interesting story about Sierra Leone. It's a very paradoxical story, and I want to show the way in which it's related to some of the issues that I raised in the chapter. So it raises an issue about elections and the extent to which elections can be the barometer of post-conflict and post-war stability. These elections, like the past 4 elections that were held, is an imperfect election. In the sense that over 200 polling stations, ballots from over 200 polling stations had to be cancelled because of irregularity. The situation in Sierra Leone yesterday was very tense. The streets were clear. There was a lot of anxiety, and social media has not helped in the sense that just before the final 25% of the votes were announced, rumors inundated the city, as well as Sierra Leonean watchers in the diaspora about what was going on. So again, showing that we keep, as a country, we sort of done due diligence in holding elections at regular interval. But it shows again, and this is a crisis that we have around the African continent, the point to which elections are being held regularly, but elections can no longer accurately give a sense of what the political landscape is like. Paradoxical in the sense that the politics of this election was also very interesting. And here I want to signal a development that took place right in the middle and towards the end of the Sierra Leonean Civil War. That is a normative shift in politics and governance in West Africa. Not even Nigeria now can have a politician who would stand up in front of Nigerians and say that I want to extend my political term more than 2 terms. more than any other region in the continent, there's a palpable normative shift in terms of holding political office in the region. The outgoing president of Sierra Leone, Ernest Bai Koroma, floated a trial balloon about wanting more time and wanting to run for a third time, and Sierra Leoneans said, "You must be crazy." That it was never going to happen. So which shows that there is a normative shift.
That's a normative shift.
Yeah, there's a normative shift in the environment. So in terms of Sierra Leonean politics, this is a very good sign. In fact, we have too much politics in Sierra Leone. 16 political parties, 16 presidential candidates ran for political office this time around. And as I said, I wanted to connect that normative shift to what happened in the middle of the Sierra Leone and Liberian Civil War during when ECOWAS adopted the Protocol on Governance and began to latch on to all of the nice liberal democratic statements about having representative governments, having periodic election, respecting the rights of citizens. It has taken quite a long time, but some of that development is now part of the landscape. The second area that I want to flag is security. This is a very interesting area. One of the causes of the Sierra Leone Civil War was, in fact, the deterioration and the degeneration of our security forces, the Internal Security Unit, the armed forces, and to a certain extent, the Sierra Leone Police Force. All kinds of rumors swirled around complicity of the Sierra Leone Police Force in all kinds of electoral ongoings during this election, but we haven't had conclusive proof put on the table that any of the security forces were engaged in any extensive malpractices or favoring of one political party. And this speaks to what is the essence of my chapter in this volume. That is the security sector reform that was supported primarily by the British, but also had other political partners involved. It was a fraught process. It was not a perfect process. But one of the outcomes that I stressed in the chapter is the sense in which we came out of the war with security forces, especially the police and the army, which were a lot better than they were before the conflict. And I'm not going to go into depth about the security sector reform that I dealt with in this chapter. The third area that I really want to underline that is significant, and this is the rub, and to a certain extent, it speaks to the shortcomings of peace building as undertaken by the United Nations through the Peacebuilding Commission, by the British through its budgetary support, but also support for development programs in Sierra Leone. And also the IMF and the World Bank are part of that particular story in terms of the development trajectory that Sierra Leone was locked into as part of post-conflict building. So we had a paradox after the war in which you had a political system that was very open in terms of political participation, in terms of freedom of expression and freedom of association. But we had a country which has had an economy that has significantly been the same. In other words, the economy that we went into the war with is more or less the economy that we still have. So the contradiction that we have an open political landscape, but we have an economy that has high rates of unemployment, that is still more or less an enclave economy that is dependent on a few minerals. The last point that I want to end up on, in terms of sort of thinking of where Sierra Leone is this balance between sort of resilience and crisis. So imagine, this is a country that has gone through, post the Civil War, 2 major crises. We are part of the Mano River Union Ebola epidemic. We also, last year, experienced serious mudslides due to heavy rainfalls. In both situations is that you did not have significant political crisis or breakdown of law and order in this case. It speaks to a particular resilience in the society and in the population. The opposite and sort of the paradox of that is that the election results shows a country that is deeply divided along ethno-regional lines, especially with the 2 leading candidates, presidential candidates that we have now going to the runoff. These are presidential candidates which are drawing their political strength and support largely from separate regions in the country that are, the APC is draws its support largely from the northwest of the country. Its political base is among the Temne people. The SLPP draws its political support largely from the south and east of the country. Its support is largely among the Mendes. The only good thing now, in terms of what's happening, is that there is a desire and there's a push for change. Third parties have done much better than expected, and these third parties would be crucial in terms of who becomes the next president of Sierra Leone. If you have questions on security sector reform and the British involvement or ECOWAS involvement, I'll be happy to respond to those. John said about 5 to 7 minutes.
So thank you very, very much. I think all 4 of these have been masterly presentations. I thought the points you just made were really important. I think the normative shift issue is fascinating. So we have this in Sierra Leone. We had it in Senegal, where Wade was denied another term. We had it in Nigeria, where Obasanjo was denied another term, a 3rd term. But we have Uganda, where Museveni apparently is determined to remain in power. We have it in Burundi, where Nkurunziza is determined to remain in power. So we have a continent that is not yet moving consistently along the lines of the normative shift that you have just described about 2-term limits and rotation of power. So I think this is really an important issue for the AU and for the UN here. So, but I thought, your other points about the divided country and so on are really important. These exist in other countries as well, these ethnic divisions and how people can be brought together. So I'd like to have like 2 or 3 questions, please, not speeches, not long speeches, not short speeches, questions, and then we'll revert back to the panel. So Sarah, does somebody else want to come in here? Anything? You've all been totally highlighted by this. Who else? I don't see him. Oh yeah, the lady there. So why don't we start with you, Madame? There's a microphone there. If you could identify yourself, you might stand up so we can all see you. And
yes, thank you. My name is Karine Kaneza. I'm from Burundi, and
great.
Speaking on behalf of the Women and Girls Movement, who's working with Helen. I have a question for Professor Adebajo. Do you have any concern for the fact that dictatorship now in Africa is actually hidden behind the concept of Pan-Africanist solidarity to actually remain consistent and evolve from dictatorship to maybe something actually worse, like fascism? Thank you.
So is some of the rhetoric a facade for dictatorships, which is a kind of an interesting question. Sarah.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. My question is related to this, and I'm wondering if the panelists can speak maybe to, particularly Helen, around the security concerns when we talk about women's engagement in peace and governance efforts, the very real threats and concerns that they face. And it's, of course, related to your important point around funding. and talk is fantastic, but what kind of support, including financial, do women need? Thank you.
So right here, the second row here, somebody, why don't you identify yourself, stand up as well so we can all see you.
Thank you. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayam. I am a journalist at the UN. And I want to ask your ideas about the ICC. There was a movement to walk out of ICC, claiming that ICC has been designated only to African issues, which is, it was proven. So where do you stand on this issue? It's for the panel to talk about. Thank
Terrific.
you.
So let's go back to the, unless anybody else has another question here, let's go back to the panel and we'll stay in the same order. Ade, you want to offer some thoughts here?
Thank you very much. Yeah, in terms of this issue of dictatorship hiding behind Pan-African solidarity, I think it's something that we've seen over the last 6 post-independence decades. And it's almost as if there's honor among thieves, you know? You've seen it, for example, in the solidarity that was shown towards Robert Mugabe for a long time among African leaders. And there was this famous incident in 1995 when Nelson Mandela, the saintly Nobel Peace Laureate, tried to sanction Sonny Abacha for hanging Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 environmental activists. And guess what? The saint actually lost. It was South Africa that found itself isolated within African diplomacy. Mandela called a SADC summit in '96 to try to sanction Abacha, and not a single state supported him. So there's this kind of feeling that we don't want this kind of pressure to come to us. And you see some of this also in Joseph Kabila, the way that Joseph Kabila is being handled in the DRC, and his glissage, his slippage strategy of just keeping on postponing these elections. And a lot of the regional organizations are supporting him. But having said that, I think what Ishmael said is also real. You know, what you had in Gambia was ECOWAS basically prepared to use military force to get rid of Ejami. And you've had other cases where Egypt, for example, was suspended from the African Union, despite the fact that it's one of the major financial contributors to the organization. So we mustn't also pretend that nothing has changed, but there are still quite a few rascals in state houses in Africa. In terms of the ICC, I mean, I just wanted to make a brief comment. There are others that may have views on it. But yeah, the ICC has, there is a widespread perception, not just among leaders in Africa, but also among academics and others, that the ICC is kind of using Africa as an experimental guinea pig. And basically is conducting selective justice, and it's given the impression that there aren't human rights abuses elsewhere in the Palestinian occupied territories, for example, in Sri Lanka, where we know that 40,000 people estimated were massacred. And as long as the ICC does not maintain a consistent caseload, this perception will continue. So sure, there are autocrats that are kind of manipulating this to get out of certain situations, but that concern is real, I think.
Great. So, Helen, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I will just respond to Sarah's question. The issue of security concerns for women engaging in peace-building process is real for women of Burundi. Because the first demonstration was carried out by women's organizations and other CSOs, but the threat of the state led them to leave the country. And none of them has been able to go back. And for those who stayed behind, they have to distance themselves, you know, from any political statements or anything. And also the media was expelled, so you don't get to know a lot of things happening within the country. These women are outside the country, but the threat is also there because they are being monitored on a daily basis. And I think even many times when we tweet about Burundi, we are also being monitored, you know, and we get some kind of backlash and the accusations of falsehood in the information that we have. So there's that kind of issue that we have as women peace builders, cyber bullying, and also physical threat to women. But also in terms of funding, we've also seen a kind of backlash in terms of the general funding for women's rights work, and more so for peace building work. A lot of mainstream funding organizations have wiped out the issues of women's rights in their portfolios, and they're talking about mainstream issues. So you have to either shift your focus or you remain in focus with limited funding. So it continues to be a challenge, in terms of where we are in the implementation of 1325, in terms of the follow-up instruments, which we have seen so much, we're even tired of them. So we keep, promoting and advocating for women's participation, and yet we don't have enough money to be able to pull it together. So it's a continuous challenge, and I'm sure you know about that. Yeah. And for the ICC, I think, I'll leave it to these guys, because what happened in South Africa a few years ago when the Sudan president was there was really a shame, because we thought that was an opportunity, for something to be done. But we see that kind of protection, that happens among African leaders, and this campaign of them stepping out. But we're also aware of the huge amount of atrocities that these guys have committed, particularly around, conflict situations, and the impunity with which these kind of violations continue to happen. The violations, the rapes that women experience is really huge. We also know about what is happening recently in Uganda in terms of the inflating the numbers of refugees, and those kind of, corrupt practices in terms of humanitarian response is also, one of those issues. But I think that human rights organizations are documenting these issues, but we don't know how much influence the international community has, like what he mentioned, to be able to insist, that these African leaders are taken to the ICC, and then against the other part of the debate, what of other leaders in other countries who have also committed atrocities? So it makes it a bit weak, in terms of the debate around, why should it be only African leaders? I will stop there. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. I'm going to respond to two questions. The one that was asked by...
Can you use your microphone?
The one that was asked by both the first and second questioner. With respect to the first, in spite of what we might see, and I think Ade was right, there are some noticeable changes. So let me give you two sets of figures, both on the security situation, the conflict situation in Africa, as well as the whole movement to what you call perpetual presidency, or what I call geriocratic leaders. First, with the conflicts. In 1998, when Kofi Annan wrote his first report on the causes of conflict in Africa and the promotion of durable peace and sustainable development, basing himself on 1996 figures, there were 14 armed conflicts in Africa in 1996. By 2016, these have fallen to 7. Now, with respect to the so-called autocratic leaders, in 2011, when the so-called Arab Spring was starting, there were 16 African leaders who had been in power for 16 years and above. In fact, some of them have been in power for some 30-something years. And like I said, 16, if you use the floor of 16, this is 4th term of an American president who was not successfully elected. By 2017, this has fallen to 10. So quite frankly, there has been some progress. And that part of the progress is attributed to something that Ade said. One, both the AU and especially in ECOWAS, Ade and Ishmael, they have put in place these mechanisms in which they are no longer recognizing countries that come to power illegitimately. But as I said in an article, if you Google my name or if you go to Twitter, go to my Twitter account, you will see 2 articles that I've written on this and I've expressed these issues. But the final one which is even more interesting is schools. In between 2002 and 2015, there have been 15 coups in Africa. That's an average of 1 coup a year. Now, I used 2002 because that was the year that the Lomé Convention came into effect, the Lomé Convention on Unconstitutional Change of Government, which was codified into Article 30 of the AU Convention. So that's an average of 1 coup a year. Now that's huge progress, because in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, we used to have 15 coups in 1 year. So having an average of 1 coup in a year over 15 years period is a big change. Final response to the question by Sarah on financing for women. Yes, I think one of the things that should be done is for a number of organizations to adopt what we did in PBS under the framework of the PBF. Namely, have what we call a gender marker. Under the PBF, as you may know, there is a gender marker in which we're encouraging people who get money from the PBF to spend at least a minimum of 15% on funding activities for women. Thank you.
So, Ishmael, thank you.
Yeah. Very quickly, on the ICC question, I mean, there are no indications that more African countries or African countries are going to pull out of the ICC other than the countries that have pulled out. I think the South African situation was an extraordinary situation. Realpolitik demanded that South Africa would never have turned Bashir over to the ICC. We have to be realistic, and we have to be people who are engaged in politics know that Realpolitik would have never allowed South Africa to turn over Bashir, and we have to be clear about that. The indictment over Bashir has not been lifted. The situation has not changed. Jammeh made some noises about pulling out of the ICC. The Gambia has not, as far as I'm concerned, formally pulled out of the ICC with the new leader. So, and partly it's because people in Africa, especially people below the state, civil society, ordinary people, have an interest in justice. What Adi said and the perception that ICC created is a real perception and should not be ignored. People who are in power derive a lot of political capital of pointing fingers at ICC and the perception that it creates that it's a court that is set up and targets Africa. But the reality is at the level of civil society and at the level of common people who really are the brunt of human rights violations, who are the at the receiving end of atrocities from leaders, do not want a situation where their leaders cannot be held accountable internationally. So that I don't think we're going to see a bandwagon movement to get out of the ICC from Africa. The first question that was asked, the concept of Pan-African leadership and dictatorship, this is the danger of talking about Africa as a whole. When you say, is this signs of dictatorship in Africa, you miss the point that this is a complicated continent with countries with individual histories and politics. The fact that you have a normative shift in West Africa, or the fact that you have leaders who, in spite of themselves, cannot run anymore for 3 or 4 terms of office, is not simply due to the generosity or that these leaders somewhere along the road to Jerusalem have seen the light. The reality of what is going on is that in this society...
Damascus.
It was to Damascus.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Yeah, but the reality is, in these countries, what you've had is you're beginning to have development of strong political cultures which are intolerant of leaders hanging on to power. In countries where leaders are hanging on to power, in fact, it's not that you do not have opposition, but you do have broad swath of the population which are latched onto and which, in a way, are part of that political culture of extending leadership in power. And Uganda is a case. To a certain extent, Rwanda is a case where you do have, we might criticize the leadership of those particular countries. Even North Africa, you have populations there post-Arab Spring who no longer, as in other parts of the country, have the kind of energy or have the kind of level of organization to push back. Last point, I think South Africa is going to see a shift, especially with Comrade Bob gone, because Comrade Bob had a special position vis-a-vis Namibia, South Africa, and the other place where it was very difficult to hold Comrade Bob accountable to the extent to which his successor is not going to be able to get away with that. So again, we're going to see some movement in South Africa. But I think the idea of saying that is this a symptom of what's going on in Africa? I think we should pull back from that. I think different countries would always move very differently in terms of openness, democratization, and change.
So this has been a great panel. I'd like to thank all four of you. I'd like to thank you, Ambassador Mohammed, again for your remarks. To my mind, all these remarks show, yes, continuing challenges, but also change is at hand and is potential and actually real. So there's a new leadership at the African Union, including your being with us here in New York. There's a new Secretary General for the last year and some. There are changes in leadership in Zimbabwe, in Angola, elsewhere that are underway. These people are not just going on and on and on forever. And there's been a pushback against those who want to stay in power indefinitely, as has been shown again in Senegal and in Nigeria, among other countries. There's also, what I'd like to add, is a new generation of young Africans. We've had programs here where we brought 70 or 80 of them here over the last years, and -3, every one of them is in Africa, working either at a civil society organization or at a university. All these individuals could be here or Washington. They choose to be in Africa, so they want to bring about change, and that's what you all are working on as well. So again, my thanks to Ambassador Mohammed, to the four of you for the panel, and let's give the panel a big hand here.